Terrific, thank you. Nice to see everybody. And this is a class this is a book that grew out of the course I taught first elsewhere and then here at Harris for many years. It's not really a book about my ideas. It's a book that tries to synthesize just decades and decades and decades of social science on this question. So I trained as an economist. I then taught for many years in a political science department as well as economics. I married and then do a lot of my research with a psychologist, and my day job increasingly looks like sociology. And so this is sort of a book that tries to bring together all of these disciplines and make them talk to one another in a sensible way, as well as sort of the hard-won lessons from practitioners. I'm not going to try to tell you every answer to why we fight or how we got on the path to peace. I'm going to try to focus on basically 5 big ideas that I think are the most powerful for me and that come out of these decades of work. And the first of those is actually that most of the time we don't fight, or as I like to say, enemies prefer to loathe in peace. And this seems like sort of a strange thing to say, at a moment when the world feels full of conflict. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a homicide epidemic in American cities, by some measures, civil conflicts being at their highest level since the 1980s, and a constant fear of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But that's partly because we focus on all the times when we do fight. And nobody really writes books or articles about the times we don't, or if they do, they can kind of get buried or unnoticed. And so a good example is 2 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I was scrolling through my 20 pages of Ukraine news on my New York Times app, and I come across this story, which is India accidentally fires cruise missile at Pakistan, and nothing happened. Right? This is a conflict that, just like most days for most of the last few decades, these two rivals have decided to loathe one another in peace. And the reason is pretty simple. It's the costs of war and the ruin of especially a potential nuclear war are unthinkable. And the thing is we miss, or we don't even read these stories. And if India had gone to war with Pakistan on March 12th of 2022, of course, the newspapers would have been full of nothing but, right? But in a way, peace is breaking out every day between these two rivals, and we just don't talk about it enough. And what that means is we're a little bit like doctors who only pay attention to the critically ill and have somehow forgotten that most of humanity is healthy, and that indeed is our natural state. And there's sort of 2 problems. In social scientists, we call this selecting on the dependent variable. All right, and selecting on the dependent variable, meaning focusing on all the times when peace fails rather than when peace succeeds, basically has 2 major problems. One is it makes us kind of depressed, right? Imagine being a medical doctor and not being aware that most people are healthy, or eventually, when they're sick, do get healthy, right? You'd be demoralized. And that is the state of a lot of people who, when they think about peace, including some peace builders. But the second, and maybe the more important problem, is that we get really, really, really rotten at diagnosis. Okay, so if you only saw sick people and you never compared them to the healthy people, right, you'd see people with bad family histories of this or that. They'd eat poorly, or they'd drink too much, or whatever sort of bad habits or characteristics. And you trace those back and you say, well, these must be the reasons that this person is sick or unhealthy. But if you also looked at the healthy people, maybe you'd see some of the same family histories, or the same bad behaviors, or the same terrible habits. And so the way we sort of figure out what drives illness is by comparing the sick to the healthy. And so we actually need to do that when we think about conflict. And that's why we need to pay attention to the times, that the 999 times out of 1,000 when 2 rivals decided to just loathe one another in peace. So why do they do that? Well, I've already hinted at this, and this is the second big lesson. War is rare because it's just so ruinous. It's basically the worst way to settle our differences. And there's a very basic arithmetic that technically is game theory, but it's so simple that it's almost commonsensical. And you can imagine 2 rivals having an issue that they want to settle, right? It could be who controls a parliament, right? It could be who controls a territory. It could be how much of the oil revenues or tax revenues or whatever it is my does my side get, right? And each time you're trying to split some kind of pie, right? And in this example, I've picked two sides where they're roughly evenly matched, right? Meaning if they went to war, they both have sort of an even odds of winning, okay? And so those evenly matched adversaries have a choice. They can split the pie that they're fighting over roughly down the middle, which is roughly in proportion to their each other's ability to just burn the house down. Or they can go to war, they can destroy a share of the thing they're fighting over because war is costly, and then they can flip a coin for who gets it, all right? And that's the pie on the right. And basically, in expected value, it's always better, you're always better off choosing peace and not fighting rather than flipping a coin for a damaged pie, okay? And so that's this basic incentive for compromise, all right? And obviously that fails, but this is a really, really fundamental starting point, right? Because it sort of shows that actually when you're working towards peace, you're not working against the grain. There isn't this sort of natural pull towards war. If anything, it's the opposite. Peace has this gravitational pull because war is so costly. So when you're peacemaking, you're working with the grain, right? And that's in some sense the good news. And this was even true of Vladimir Putin, right? Who for 20 years tried every other means imaginable to co-opt Ukrainian politics short of war and invasion. Right? And he used dark money and propaganda and persuasion and political assassinations and support for separatists and on and on and on and on, right? And it was only when those repeatedly failed that war was even an option on the table. And indeed, Russia has managed to co-opt the politics not only of its own country, but of much of its neighbors, much like any superpower. It's managed to co-opt the politics of its neighbors without resorting to invasion. So even within its general sphere of influence, Ukraine is an exception. And why is that? It's because, as we've seen, this war is so unimaginably costly to both sides. Okay, but I didn't write a book about, I didn't title my book, Why We Don't Fight, right? Obviously we do fight, we fight far too much. And whether that's gangs or ethnic groups or political factions or countries, we do have an awful lot of war. And if you had to remember one thing from this entire presentation or the entire book, it's basically the simple fact that every time we fight is a reason that our leaders or societies ignored those costs of war or are willing to pay them. Okay, that's why it's so important to start from this point of view that war is costly and that it's not in our basic interests. Because every time we fight, it's because there's some reason that we ignored or were willing to pay this incentive for compromise. Okay, and the good news, I suppose, is actually there's really just 5 main ways that happens. Okay, there's a reason for every war and a war for every reason. They're all different, right? But there's sort of logic's rhyme. There's only so many ways this basic cost-benefit calculus can break down, right? And I call them when our leaders are unaccountable, when they or our societies are ideological, biased, uncertain, or unreliable. Okay, and these are slightly less technical terms for a set of concepts from economics, game theory, psychology, behavioral science that basically we would think of as agency problems, non-standard preferences, persistently erroneous beliefs, asymmetric information, or commitment problems. Okay, and so what I try to do in the class I teach here and in the book is sort of transfer these social science, sometimes complicated social science concepts, which have not been delivered to a general audience, and try to make them understandable. Okay, and in many ways, they're very, very simple, all right, and quite intuitive. And the first one is, why would we go to war when it's costly? Well, not all leaders are accountable for all of those costs, okay? In particular, a leader who is unchecked, and the most extreme example, and every kind of leader is unchecked and unaccountable to some degree. But of course, the most extreme example is a personalized dictator. And these unchecked leaders can, what if they don't pay all those costs of war? Why would they? If they're not accountable to the soldiers or the families, or if it's not their particular share of the pie that's getting destroyed, well, why take that into account? Now, leaders still do bear some costs and risks, and so they still should have an incentive to compromise. But that wedge, right, the costs that sort of deter them are much, much smaller. All right, and what can often happen is that on top of this is that some leaders, unchecked leaders, may have a private incentive for war. They may see their personal share of the pie or their cabal or their group's share of the pie expanding through warfare, right? Maybe it's increases their perceived the chances that they hold on to power, right? Or the share of the oil revenues they could grab domestically. Okay, and so unchecked leaders can not only ignore some costs of war, they might have a private incentive to take their group to war. All right, and this is potentially one of the most common drivers of conflict in history, and it's a good starting point for thinking about Putin's invasion of Ukraine as a not just an unchecked leader a personalized dictator who doesn't bear all the costs of war, but someone who may have a private incentive in terms of thinking that exterminating this democratic EU drifting country might actually be a threat to his regime domestically, because Russians identify with Ukrainians probably more than any other people on the planet. And so this is sort of a dangerous democratic example to have on his doorstep. The other set of explanations that people have is that we ignore the cost of war. We're willing to pay the cost of war because we get something ephemeral or intangible as a result of fighting. Okay, and so we're willing to pay that. And that could be glory, or that could be vengeance, or that could be status, or that could be some more nobler goal, some principle on which we refuse to compromise. And the most common story you hear about Russia that sort of fits in this category is a Russian president or an inner cabal who is consumed with ideas of either national or personal glory. And thus they are pursuing this war on ideological grounds. They're willing to pay some costs of war in order to achieve some ethereal or intangible ideal. That may or may not be true. No one really peers inside the head of Putin. You have to be, I think, very careful when sort of ascribing these kinds of ideological views to such a closed and inaccessible political group. The other ideological story of this war is a story of Ukrainians who are unwilling to essentially, due to liberal ideals, are willing to bear some costs of war in order to achieve some idea of some sovereignty or liberty. And this is the story of every freedom fighter in history, whether it's the Algerians fighting for independence against the French, or the Mau Mau in Kenya, or the American revolutionaries against Britain, right? This is a common theme of a powerful tyrannical overlord, war not making sense, and yet to some extent that underdog fighting merely on principle. Okay, the third story of war is when our leaders or societies are biased, all right? That cost-benefit calculus I showed you, we get it wrong. We underestimate the costs, or we overestimate our chances of victory, right? And the story you hear in the newspapers the most that fits in this bucket is an isolated, insulated Vladimir Putin, a president, an autocrat, a personalized autocrat who is insulated from the truth. Nobody's kicking bad information up the chain, all right? This is a classic problem of autocracies, right? It's a story of institutional bias. It's not that Vladimir Putin is necessarily personally overconfident or misreads the situation, but rather it's an institutional problem of bad information or some information not making it up the chain, right? And it's also a charge leveled against many democratic governments as well. It's a charge leveled against the Bush White House in the run-up to the Iraq and the Afghan war, right? Good, essentially unpleasant information not making it up the chain. All right, so these are all stories of institutional bias, which we can layer on top of all of the stories you hear about overconfidence and other sort of psychological and behavioral biases. All right, and in the book, I talk about a whole set of biases that essentially lead us to get that cost-benefit calculus wrong, to make mistakes, and thus go to war. Okay, the last two are a little bit more subtle. They're arguably some of the most important reasons for why two adversaries find themselves fighting, but they're ones that get talked about the least. And one of them is just simple uncertainty. So all of us have to cast our minds back to 12, 13 months ago and how uncertain it was, how Russia's military strength and capabilities, Ukrainian pluckiness and resolve, and Western unity on sanctions, right? And the idea that Russia would get a bad draw on all three was always within the realm of possibilities, but nobody predicted it. Absolutely no one. And least of all Vladimir Putin. Okay, and so amidst this uncertainty, war becomes a gamble. Okay, and it becomes a gamble that you can get wrong. And what's more, and there's nothing strategic or game theoretic about that yet, but once you have this uncertainty, right? It actually means that war is sometimes a rational actor's best response, even though it's costly. And all of you understand this already if you've ever played a game of poker, in the sense that you observe your cards and your opponent observes theirs, and you don't know what they have. And you know instinctively, without working out any calculations, that your optimal strategy is not to bluff none of the time, right? You also know your optimal strategy is not to bluff all the time. You know that your optimal strategy amidst this uncertainty is to bluff some of the time, to do so unpredictably. And in response to that, you know that your adversary, their optimal response is not to fold all of the time, nor is it to call or invade all of the time, right? It's to do so some of the time. And so what uncertainty does is it creates not just a gamble, but it creates a situation where it's strategically optimal to call or invade some of the time in response to a bluff that you fear is going to appear some of the time. Okay, and so this, I think we tend to grossly underestimate. We forget the strategic incentives, and we love to blame war on the personal failings or biases of a leader, or on the ideologies of a people. I think those are relevant, but I think we're just sort of missing some of the strategic logic underlying some of these conflicts. And the fifth and last sort of strategic conflict logic that lies behind war is probably one that doesn't help us understand, or isn't first order in explaining Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's the idea of commitment problems that our adversaries are unreliable, okay? And the classic example is called the preventative war. It's when one side is rising in power and the other can't trust them to commit to a deal. And so this is a story that's told to explain World War I, World War II, the US invasion of Iraq, right? One where a sudden change in power of an adversary sort of gives one side, the temporarily powerful side, an incentive to lock in their advantage while they can, right? That's not what was going on in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So you don't always need all five, right? You might only need one or two or three, and different ones and different subsets of them to understand different wars, right? These are just some very different logics, okay? But I think this power shifting can help us understand a little bit the timing of this invasion, because you can make an argument that in 2022 or 2021 that Russia was at its peak leverage vis-a-vis Ukraine. That Ukraine was acquiring defensive weaponry in the form of Turkish drones and its own Neptune missiles. It was growing closer to the EU. It was drifting further and further in terms of its political elites from Russian influence. And so there was a certain lock in our advantage now or never kind of incentive for Russia to use war as its last resort at that moment. Okay, so I've given sort of these five abstract reasons that can help us understand most conflicts. I don't personally work at the level of Russian or great power politics. That's not where I study. I spent my career mostly studying first civil wars in sub-Saharan Africa, then moving to understanding organized criminal conflict in South America, to studying street violence in Chicago, and ethnic and other forms of conflict in West Africa, okay? And all of these lessons, all these sorts of logics to why we fight, not only sort of help us understand and govern countries, but actually ethnic groups and gangs and village conflicts. And let me give an example by just talking about Chicago, where, which like many American cities has been experiencing an increase in homicides, all right? These are essentially targeted assassinations between members of small rival groups. Decades ago, we might have called these gangs. Gangs in Chicago, like many American cities, were well-organized, almost firm-like hierarchical structures. Today, those are much more fragmented and broken apart. And so they identify as cliques and crews and mobs, all right? And so they're not gangs. Gangs are organized. These are small, disorganized, almost social groupings of maybe 3, 5, 10 young men, right? And those cliques and mobs are engaged in rivalrous behavior, and sometimes that is escalated into targeted assassinations, right? And that's basically what's driving much of the violence in many American cities. Okay, and so what's going on? Well, you hear three kinds of stories about this kind of urban violence. All right, the first one you hear is of young men who are responding emotionally and angrily to perceived slights, right? The second you hear is crews that are engaged in long-running rivalries over a past killing or a past offense, and they're seeking vengeance, they're seeking revenge. All right, so that's not a mistake. It's not something they regret the day after. It's the pursuit of justice. And indeed, some of the crews and mobs that I've worked with and interviewed, because we have a program to reduce violence that's been amazingly successful, partly because it's tackling these two causes of violence, right? They're called Danny Mob and Johnny Mob. Well, who are Danny and Johnny? Well, they're brothers or friends of the members who were killed maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And so half of the existence of this group is therefore the pursuit of vengeance. All right. And most newspaper accounts and popular accounts of violence end there. And they forget the strategic roots of some of this violence. And one of those comes from one of the men in our program who was the leader of one of these crews. And he says, look, here's how I became a killer. I was trying to sell drugs with my group and they robbed us. They robbed us because they didn't know how strong and resolved we were. And we realized that we had to craft a reputation. We would have to show them what we were made of. And so we conducted a set of, shootings until they knew what we were made of, right? And so in a world where his strength and resolve was written on his forehead, they never would have risked robbing him, right? This is essentially a story of uncertainty, because there's no need for reputation in a world of certainty, right? Reputation is only something that you need to build in a world of uncertainty. It's going back to that poker game I mentioned a few minutes ago, where not only are you playing with you're not just playing with your rival, every single other potential rival, right? Every other clique or crew around is sitting there staring at you and trying to figure out how strong you are and how resolved you are based on how you're playing this one game. And so with these, there's this uncertainty that sort of this incentive for reputation sort of multiplies as soon as you live in a dangerous neighborhood. And that's true for gangs and it's true for countries. So what I've just told you basically is a story where there are three logics that are either a bias, a pursuit of an intangible objective, or a case of uncertainty and a strategic need to construct reputation when the true strength and resolve is unknown. All right, and when I say these three or these five help explain war at every level, I really mean it, because when I actually try to explain why the United States went into Afghanistan and stayed for 20 years, I use these exact three same stories, right? So number one, there are stories of miscalculation. I already told you a story about accusations of a biased Bush administration that essentially was impervious to bad news, right? And was persistently optimistic, both from a psychological perspective and from an institutional perspective. Okay, and so that's one story, right, that you hear, right? And you can believe it or you can throw it away, but that's the kind of story that is. It's a story of bias. There's a story of vengeance, right? There's the purpose of fighting the war was to essentially bring bin Laden and the Taliban elite to justice or to kill them, okay? And you can imagine a world in which leaders of Al-Qaeda are captured in 2003 or 2004, and this war is over much sooner, that vengeance having been served, right? And those are two stories, and most accounts end there. And I think what they overlook is this strategic incentive born of uncertainty and the need and the idea that what the United States is actually engaged in over this 20 years, and the reason they go in is not merely bias or vengeance, but actually a calculated desire for building a reputation that the United States cannot be invaded on its own territory, right? Because in 2001, the United States is perceived as weak. It's never going to put boots on the ground in a country. If they do, like in Somalia, in the mid-90s, they're going to pull them out the minute that there's a death. They're not going to go into a place like Rwanda to stop genocides. And the only time they're going to march in and engage in a humanitarian intervention of some kind is either in the Balkans when it's in the heart of Europe, or in Kuwait when it threatens oil reserves. And otherwise, it's basically a free-for-all. And so the idea, and lest you sort of doubt that, reputation was at the heart of American motives to fight and continue this war, you just have to think about at every moment in this conflict, when not only when things got tough, but especially when things got tough, the question that was asked, or the question that was raised in the halls of power, was not what signal would us leaving send to the Taliban, right? What signal would this send to Al-Qaeda? That mattered, but mostly people were saying, what would that say? What would that say to the next terror group? What would that say to China? What would that say to Russia? What would that say to North Korea? What would that signal to the Iranian National Guard? All right. So this was, again, an idea, an opportunity for the American government to signal its resolve to not just to this current adversary, but to all future potential adversaries, and to deter future attacks on American soil. All right. And so you can endorse that or be as repulsed as you feel about as a drug leader who kills merely to establish his reputation and preserve his drug profits. I don't care. I think you need to understand it, and I think our systematic failure to sort of think about some of the strategic logics of war is one of the reasons we're really, in some sense, bad at avoiding them. Okay, the last half of the book is a little bit more optimistic, and it sort of talks about all of these cases, all these 999 out of 1,000 cases where enemies loathe one another peace, or even better yet, have built all sorts of insulation against war, right? But what do those have in common? And how do we follow that example in all these cases where peace has failed? And basically the answer is that every successful society has basically tackled each of these 5 problems and tried to build lots of insulation or buffers in order to avoid warfare. So if we had, if we were to take my class, we would talk, for days about the ways in which societies have checked their leaders over time, about the ways that we've constructed ideologies locally, nationally, internationally, against violence, about all of the ways, all the institutions and all of the norms we've constructed to reduce our biases, all of the institutions that countries or groups build, from spycraft to effective forms of communication to reduce levels of uncertainty, and all of the international and national and local ways in which we sort of try to solve commitment problems. I'm just going to talk about one example. I'm going to talk about one of the interventions we do in an active conflict, which is the role of mediators, right? We have a whole set of interventions once conflicts are running: mediators, peacekeepers, sanctions, etc. And we can think of all of these interventions in terms of their potential to solve these 5 problems. And I stick with mediation because I sort of wonder, like, in some sense, like, what exactly are mediators do? How do we understand this intervention and whether or not it's effective through the lens of this 5? Okay. And the short answer is mediators are only effective when they are effectively able to reduce uncertainty. Basically, they are trying to use their own credibility and their own resources to investigate, verify, and provide reputational guarantees, right, of one party versus the other. And if they're not able to do that, they're not going to be effective. They're effective when they're able to reduce biases and basically get leaders to behave like the rational bargainers in our models. Okay, and they are effective when they find clever ways to find commitment when there are commitment problems, and when they tackle, basically, when they sort of find these angers and intangible incentives like vengeance and try to help adversaries settle those and find ways to settle those differences without using violence. Okay, and if mediators are effective at this, then this is essentially why they would work. But we don't know if they work because no one gets to run a rigorous study of sending the foreign dignitaries around the world to sort of see which kinds of interventions work. Now, if we had more time, I could talk about some of the grassroots level evidence we have on mediators working in village conflicts and court systems, etc. And they do seem to work because they solve these problems. I'd rather tell you about a totally different and unlikely set of mediators and peacekeepers in Medellin, Colombia, which is a place where I've been working for the last 7 years, trying to understand why this city, which like Chicago, is full of hundreds of small and in this case, much more well-organized gangs. But why does it have a homicide rate that's one of the lowest in the Western Hemisphere for a large city, and maybe a quarter of that of many large American cities, and maybe a tenth of that of many large Latin American cities? Okay, and the way that I learned about this was talking to some of these leaders as we've been trying to understand how these systems of organized crime work. We've been not only collecting data, but we've been interviewing mid and high-ranking leaders of many of these criminal organizations, some on the outside, but many of them in prison, because this is where many of Medellin's criminal leaders not only live, but currently operate their criminal enterprises. And one of them told us a story about a fight that broke out over a game of billiards in the prison's game room. And he doesn't remember why the fight broke out or over what, probably some incident of petty cheating. But he does remember that one side pulled out their guns and fired on the other. Now, why they're carrying guns in a Medellin prison is an entirely different sort of masterclass. Suffice to say, in this case, tragically, 23 people were injured. Fortunately, nobody was killed. Nonetheless, as you can imagine, this led to a cycle of retaliatory shootings inside prison and then outside of prison in these two rival gangs' territories. And every single gang in the city lined up behind one side or the other, and they geared for war, right? And at times, at 2 or 3 occasions in the past, Medellin's gangs have gone to war. And when they have, Medellin has become the most violent place on the planet. 5 times more violent than most intense civil or international war happening in the world today. But that's not what happened after this billiards incident. What actually happened was both sides decided to loathe one another in peace. Now, why was that? Well, partly this is because war is costly. Not only do you lose your own potential life, the life of your foot soldiers, but nobody sells drugs in the middle of a gunfight. The shopkeepers and the residents are not going to pay their protection fees and their extortion when there's no protection. And so war is incredibly costly, all right? But more than that, there's also a set of criminal institutions that have developed to preserve that peace, right? So even though there's 400 independent autonomous gangs in Medellin, they're not sort of living in anarchy, all right? They're not just sort of engaged in 400 rivalries with, or 400 squared rivalries with one another. Rather, there are about 17 political confederations of street gangs that report up to or have a sort of an affiliation with a more powerful, small but powerful mafia-like organization that are sometimes known as razones. Okay, and so what you see here is actually these political confederations with these autonomous gangs and which razón they're affiliated with. And indeed, of these 17 razones sort of align themselves in 2 factions. All right. And they themselves have constructed an organization that governs those 2 factions called La Oficina, or the office. Okay. And when trouble breaks out between 2 gangs in the city, it's these razones that step in. All right. So if the gang leaders are unchecked, if they're ideological, seeking vengeance, or if they're biased, well, these razón leaders will provide a set of sanctions, a set of incentives, or if necessary, mediation in order to reduce those problems, all right? If the gangs are uncertain, right, or if they fail to commit to, or if the 2 gangs are unable to commit to peace, well, these guys are only too happy to facilitate that information sharing or to hold them to a deal. And that's why they've constructed La Oficina, okay? And so they've essentially built a set of institutions that try to govern this conflict. And the only time when the only time when Medellin does go to war is when one of the razones decides that it wants to make a grab for power. And that's when La Oficina and most of the institutions that they've constructed break down. And the reason I like to sort of tell the story of Medellin is because it's actually just a metaphor or an analogy for our wider world, right? We live in a world of 200 autonomous countries, all right? But we also live in a world of what political scientists call hegemonic alliances, all right? And so there are a set of alliances, some of them, and each one with their own raison, and that, one of them is headed by the United States, one of them is headed by the EU, one of them is headed by Russia, another by China. More regionally, we have things like the African Union and so forth. And what these sort of razones do is they constructed a set of imperfect institutions. We don't call it L'Officina, we call it the UN Security Council, right? And they have a set of sanctions and peacekeepers and a whole other set of tools and mediators that they've constructed to basically try to not only maintain peace help maintain peace within their sphere of influence, within their confederation, right? But also to deter others from war elsewhere in the world. Okay, and these institutions that have been constructed on a global level, just like Medellin, they're not equal, they're not democratic, they're not terribly effective, and they're only deployed sporadically, and they're usually deployed in the interests of one of those razones or superpowers. Okay, and just like Medellin, these systems really break down when one of the superpowers, be that Russia or the United States, when one of the razones decides that it wants to act unilaterally. Okay, and so we learn a lot, I think, from understanding how conflict operates at these different levels. We can actually learn a lot about how to construct a better system of institutions by studying these successful societies. I do want to stop there in order to answer questions, but I hope you will join us here at Harris, and then you'll have a whole course to explore these ideas if you like. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. There are a lot of questions that have come in, so I'll just go ahead and jump right into it. Anand was asking about the case of political struggles and political parties when communities are repressed by the historical, social, and economical injustice for generations by those in power in the form of conventional political and ideologies. What can they do to gain the upper hand and tackle these repressive political power structures effectively?
Yeah, so this is a great point. I mean, I think I like to point out that there's nothing just about peace. All right. I gave you an example early on of the cost benefit calculus for conflict, right? Between two evenly matched adversaries, right? That's still the case, right? Most societies, we have, in much of the world, right? One side has 90% of the guns, or 90% of the economic power, or 90% of the mobilizational power, or 90% of the control of information. All right. And so and that side gets to claim 90% of the pie, roughly. Right. So that's the story of most dictators, right? That's the story of Russia, or that's the story of most countries for most of their histories, where an elite cabal controls most of the guns and power. And then the repressed are repressed. They don't revolt. All right. Why don't they revolt? They don't revolt because war is so costly, right? Their incentive is to compromise with that tyrannical superpower or that tyrannical autocrat or king or whomever that may be. And so there's nothing just or equal about that. And it's why most of the time people don't revolt. And so I think, the way that we think, if you were to take Jim Robinson's class or any one of our political economy classes, you'd learn that over history, the democratization and the gathering of freedom has often not been violent. Right? Most democratization has been a series of revolutions without revolt. It's been the repressed people gaining more economic power, gaining more mobilizational power, gaining more guns, and therefore compelling that elite cabal to share some of the power. And then that elite cabal just shares just enough power to avert revolt. All right. And so democratization and freer countries are ones where the economic and social and other incentives align such that it gives the repressed enough claims against the elite that they relinquish more and more and more of their power. And unfortunately, we live in a world where that has not happened everywhere.
We have a question from Trevor that wants to dig into the gender-based analysis of this. Have you found out if there's any difference between men and women?
So I think if we were talking about interpersonal conflict, it would be first order. All right. We know that, males, both for biological and in most societies, social reasons, are tend to be more aggressive. Okay. Once we move back to the level of big groups who are deliberating over long periods of time, day after day, considering whether to go to war as a collective and also whether to continue to go to war after day 1 or day 10 or day 365. These, I think, personal and psychological, individual psychological, so whether it's male aggression, just any number of psychological problems we may have that lead us to be violent interpersonally, they recede somewhat. All right, they don't become irrelevant, but they recede somewhat. The sense in which I think gender is first order is that societies that have disenfranchised women essentially are unchecked in the sense that 50% of the population has no say. Okay, and if 50% of the population has no say, then why would leaders internalize the costs of war to at least half of society? Okay, and so the extent to which I think women's rights and women's enfranchisement, or the enfranchisement or rights of any group, large or small, in a society is peacemaking, is in the sense that it's compelling leaders to internalize the costs of war to that group. And so this, to me, is the first order way in which gender is important. It's for this agency problem, for this reducing uncheckedness, rather than maybe the psychological things that come along with gender.
Okay. We've got another question from Henry that is kind of forward looking. As the field of conflict resolution evolves in coming years, addressing these root causes, what new challenges and opportunities do you anticipate? What approaches do you believe are going to be most effective in tackling these issues?
So, I'll talk some of my own work, just as one example, is I think what is looking more increasingly at organized criminal conflict and gang conflict throughout the Americas. So this includes, Chicago, Monterrey, Mexico, Medellin, Colombia, Rio in Brazil. And one of the really amazing things that I've discovered, having come from this sort of civil conflict world and starting to work on gang and organized criminal conflict, is how the first thing you do in a civil war or an international war is you try to mediate. Right? You reduce uncertainty between both sides, try to get them to be less biased, try to find different ways to find commitment or achieve these intangible objectives like some kind of justice or vengeance. And how we never do that with gangs. Okay, we don't do it in Mexico. The government doesn't do it in Mexico. We don't do it here in Chicago. Occasionally, you will find civil society leaders who do so. There might be a priest or minister or an ex-gang leader or someone who's doing this on the side, but we don't do it systematically. And so one of the things I'm working on right now, both in Chicago and Mexico and in Medellin, is sort of trying to study examples of gang level mediation and seeing whether or not actually we can build large scale quantitative evidence to demonstrate that it works. And therefore have more cities pick up this very basic style of intervention to sort of reduce violence. It won't reduce all violence in the city, but I think it'll make a huge difference.
We've got some other questions that have been coming in. Let's see. How do we or decision makers estimate the cost of war and gains from war, given the uncertainty around it and its potential to cause war?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges. That's another source of uncertainty. It's not just an uncertainty over our adversaries' resolve or our adversaries' weaponry and what they can do, but what if we're really bad at? What if we're just make really noisy estimates of the cost of war? What do we do as what do gangs do? A friend of mine who's a peacemaker here in Chicago right now, but 40 years ago was a leader of a gang here in Chicago. He says he used to go gangbanging, right? And I said, what do you mean by that? He says, well, I go shoot up the other side. I wouldn't try to, hit anybody, but I just sort of show them what I was made of, right? And he was trying to reduce their uncertainty and his own uncertainty about the cost of war, and basically just how tough it would be, and just how tough he is. So, and that's exactly what nations do. Nations gangbang. We have military parades, and we fire test missiles, and we have border skirmishes, and we do all of these things that are designed to signal just how costly war will be to our enemies. And so it's not so different. And this is just one way in which we're trying to reduce uncertainty, right? And so there's I could talk about espionage and intelligence and diplomacy, and these are all sort of techniques that groups use in order to basically tackle this basic problem.
Deep has a question. Is it so that violence begins with more motivated individuals or groups at the fringe who have less to lose and increased hostility? They create a contagion effect on the rest. If so, how can this effect be stopped?
So I think, my personal reading is that that's part of this issue of selection on the dependent variable, that there are lots of extremist groups. Every society has its extremist groups at every level. And the fact is that most of them don't use large scale and sustained violence. And so if anything, it's the opposite. It's most of these groups do not. It's many times this violence is not contagious, and that most oppressed or most angry or most extreme groups in society don't use sustained violence, or when they do use violence, they use it briefly and selectively, maybe more as to signal their strength, sort of like this skirmishing and gangbanging, rather than a sustained assault of long-term day after day after day violence, right? So I think most of the violence is actually quite strategic and used for signaling rather than otherwise. So I almost see the opposite of contagion.
We have a question from Sergey, and he was asking about, is it a good idea to describe another facet of ideological motivation for war as issue indivisibility to kind of connect this body of work? And then Sergey also had some comments on kind of this commitment problem in the Ukraine war. Overall, kind of Sergey making a note about that.
So there's this old idea that's gone out of fashion in political science called issue indivisibility. And it's the idea that, there's a sacred site that two groups refuse to share. And that's why they're fighting. There's another version of that is there's an ethnic homeland that both sides refuse to concede, right? You could, in some sense, point to the Ukraine as an example of what's seemingly an ideological indivisibility, which is to say that both Russia and Ukraine want to control Eastern Ukraine, and Ukraine simply on ideological grounds refused to give it up. Ukraine is indivisible. Okay, I think that's probably underrated as a conflict. So this is not a strategic driver of war. This is saying that one side has some intangible incentive or some ideological commitment that essentially refuses to compromise. There is a bargaining range. There is a reason to compromise, but one or both sides refuses to make that compromise because they find it repugnant. And so I actually think this is quite important for understanding. It's a non-strategic reason for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think you can understand the war on drugs and the war on cartels in these terms. It's mostly fought by democratic governments who refuse to compromise with powerful cartels on principle. They find the idea repugnant, and therefore they run these interminable wars on drug organizations and drug cartels. And we could go through the list. So I sort of would put that underneath that ideological frame of the five.
Linda has a question about countering misinformation and disinformation that helps drive the biases and make the leader unaccountable for driving toward war. And she gave examples of Putin and George W. Bush, as well as QAnon and other things like that. How do we combat this misinformation?
Yeah, so one way to think of this is that we have leaders or groups in every society that think that war is in their private interest. It's either in their private material interest because they're unchecked, or they may have some ideological incentive for war, and whether that is political or religious or whatever that may be. Okay, and when that unchecked and ideological subgroup decides it wants to go to war, it tries to use misinformation in order to bring the rest of the population with them. All right. And so whether we're talking about Hindu Muslim riots in India or autocrats taking their nations to war or so forth, constantly what you see are elite groups who are trying to use misinformation to essentially help basically carry the masses along in a war that's only in the private incentives of the elite. And so anyway, that's one way to think about what misinformation does. And then we have a set of institutions which are designed to counter that misinformation, and a set of practices which I think at this point are sort of inadequate and somewhat flawed. Oh, I think you're
got it. Thank you. We had a question from Adrish that looks at the Russia-Ukraine, India-China, US-Russia conflict and makes a comparison between military exercises helping to achieve an upper hand and how that might compare to police exercises internally bringing tranquility to internal affairs. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two ways to think about intervention. One is you can intervene to strengthen one side versus another, right? So the America's role in and Western Europe's role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is not to necessarily push both sides towards peace. Currently, it's designed to actually strengthen the bargaining power of one side. There are another set of interventions, military or otherwise, that are actually designed to change the incentives of both parties to stop using violence to settle their differences. All right, and that's typically what peacekeeping operations and mediators and such do, right? And so I think every time we sort of, and we often conflate these things, we because they use a lot of the same money and a lot of the same tools, but we have to distinguish between the types of international and external interventions that are trying to shift the bargaining power so that the ultimate settlement favors one side versus the other, versus actually trying to make that settlement come about.
Nima has a specific question about social media. Can this increase in conflicting personalities for authoritarian leaders? Are there examples of leaders who've monitored social media, and how has this affected their ability to maintain authoritarian control over supporters and rivals?
Yeah, so it can in some ways cut both ways. So first of all, we actually have a tremendous number of scholars here at Harris who study autocratic politics. I think it's one of our real strengths. And if you took one of those classes or you read some of this material, you'd learn about how actually why do so many autocrats hold elections, and why do they allow so much free exchange on social media rather than none? And of course, some choose none, but actually, an autocrat's classic problem is information, right? It's constantly knowing what are people upset about? What are people angry about? What exactly, and what is the bargaining power of my rival, which is of the masses here? And so social media and elections in a controlled way are actually a really good way for dictators to solve that information problem, okay? And so social media can be an instrument of uncertainty reduction, all right? To the extent, but then both sides are constantly innovating to try to use it to strengthen their bargaining power vis-a-vis the other side, right? The repressed are trying to organize and mobilize and thus compel the elite to give over more power, ideally peacefully, right? And the elite and the government institutions are constantly trying to use it as a way to improve, basically reduce contagion, reduce the ability of these organizations to mobilize. And so I think what we've seen over the last 15 years is a swing from social media being something that's empowering a lot of people to one that's actually that a lot of autocratic governments have figured out how to use it to repress more effectively. And so where this ends up in the long run is anyone's guess.
Okay, we are close to time, so I will end with one more question. Folks, I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. This chat was happening. This felt like a lightning round, but Ashina has one last question about misperception and uncertainty as to why wars occur. She mentioned you talked about this in the book and the presentation. Could you elaborate on the difference between these two? She couldn't understand why both can't be applied simultaneously, or can they be applied simultaneously?
I think I need you to, which can't be applied simultaneously?
Misperception and uncertainty.
Oh, I see. So it's a good point. So these ideas of a misperception or a bias needs uncertainty, right? You can't be overconfident in a world of complete certainty. You can't have a persistently erroneous understanding of your enemy or their motivations or what they're likely to do in a world with complete certainty. And but I think I wanted to distinguish between the idea that there uncertainties drives, there's a strategic, amidst uncertainty, even totally rational, unbiased, unprejudiced people with no misperceptions whatsoever can still find it strategically optimal to invade and bluff some of the time. And I wanted to draw the distinction between that sort of strategic incentive and then the set of other things that becomes possible amidst uncertainty, which is all of our human and institutional capacities to really misread our own abilities or to misread the abilities and the intention of the other side.
Right. That was our last question that we had time for. Chris, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and for giving us this presentation and answering all of these very specific and detailed questions. And thanks to everyone for their participation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.